Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Ben Francis and tonight I'm joined by Scottish independence activist William Duguid. Hey William, how's it going?
It's going fine, thank you very much, and thanks for having me back on, Ben. Looking forward to it.
Me too. So first we'll start the show as usual with an update on the war in Ukraine on day 1021 of the conflict. Volodymyr Zelensky said on Sunday that 43,000 Ukrainian soldiers had been killed in the war, while over 370,000 injured. About half had been able to return to service after treatment. The Ukrainian president said 198,000 Russian soldiers had been killed and a further 550,000 injured. Almost 800,000 Russian troops are deployed in Ukraine, the president said. These figures were not independently verified. On Monday, Zelensky made the case for a diplomatic settlement to end Russia's war in Ukraine and raised the idea of foreign troops being deployed in his country until it could join the NATO military alliance. It came after Donald Trump said Kiev was ready to make a deal with Moscow to stop the war and that Vladimir Putin should make efforts towards negotiating a truce. The Ukrainian president told reporters he was hoping to call the outgoing US President Joe Biden in the coming days to discuss NATO membership. Quote, a troop contingent from one country or another could be present in Ukraine for as long as it isn't part of NATO, but for that we need to have a clear understanding of when Ukraine becomes an EU member state and a NATO member state, Zelensky said. The French President Emmanuel Macron caused controversy in Europe last February when he raised the possibility of European nations sending troops to Ukraine. Quote, even if we get invited into NATO, what happens then? Who guarantees our security? Who can think about that and work on Emmanuel Macron's proposal, Zelensky said. Zelensky asked for more support from Berlin against Russia while meeting the current German opposition CDU party leader Friedrich Merz, who is leading opinion polls ahead of elections scheduled next February in Germany. We are counting on stronger, more decisive actions from Germany, from you personally. We are counting on it very much, Zelensky said, mentioning Ukraine's request for an invitation to join NATO and for long-range missiles. Merz has urged the current Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, to send Ukraine the long-range Taurus missile system, which could fire deep into Russian territory, something Scholz has refused to do, citing the fears of escalation. Estonian Prime Minister Kristen Michel was also in Kiev on Monday to meet Zelensky and other senior officials, including Ukraine's Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal. Ukrainian officials said Russian attacks killed a 91-year-old woman in the village of Stara Mykolaiva in Donetsk region on Monday, as shelling also wounded 4 others. A man was killed in the southern Kherson region, said the local governor Alexander Pokudin. Ukraine will also soon get another €4.2 billion after the EU's member states approved the planned payment the EU Council announced. The money is intended to help Ukraine's struggling economy. So, William, just to pick up on the start of that story, how likely do you think it is now that a negotiated settlement or diplomatic settlement that Zelensky was talking about can actually happen? Because the rhetoric seems to have changed quite a lot on that now that Trump's won the presidency. But what do you think the actual prospects are?
Well, Trump doesn't know how he's going to create a settlement, but one would imagine that it would be through encouraging negotiation. I agree with you that the rhetoric has changed. It seems to me that Zelensky is keeping his options as open as he possibly can. So he's talking to the prospective new German chancellor if the elections there go the way expected, with a view perhaps to being able to get hold of the Taurus missiles should it come to it and be able to penetrate deep into Russia. That would, I think, be an escalation, but it's certainly something that's on the agenda. But at the same time, he is now talking about a diplomatic settlement and how that will pan out. And I think he's just trying to get control of that particular conversation before it goes anywhere. But Trump will be a wild card with this. There's no doubt about it. And particularly in terms of where things go with NATO, because Trump has a very interesting record in his dealings with NATO and asking for the other members of NATO to stump up, but also showing perhaps a willingness not to expend too much effort in Europe in the future. So it's very hard to call, and I think probably Zelensky, they must be doing his head in right now, but he really does have to cover all these options. I think, in answer directly to your question, we are beginning to look as if we're approaching, if not the end of the war, the end of the beginning. But yeah, the devil will be in the detail, and there will be negotiation. I think at some point in the first quarter of 2025.
Yeah, it does certainly look like that might be what's coming. But how important do you think like this period of time before Trump gets inaugurated is? Because quite a lot of action seems to be going on during the last month or so of the Biden presidency.
Yeah, I think Zelensky wants to be in NATO before Biden leaves office. That's for sure. There is an urgency about it and trying to get things done and trying to get all the ducks in whatever row they need to be.
Yeah.
So yeah, one can sense that. And it's a very interesting bit of shuttling about Zelensky is doing. And I'm sure Putin, in his own way, we haven't heard too much about what Putin's up to. He may be licking his wounds with what's happened in Syria, but we shall see. There will be something coming from Putin and his backers as well, but we just don't know what that is yet.
So speaking of Syria, looking at the time, we're going to have to move on to the update, or the latest update on the Middle East. At least 44,786 Palestinians have been killed and over 106,000 wounded in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023, according to a statement by the Gaza Health Ministry. In Lebanon, at least 4,047 have been killed and over 16,600 injured since the same time period. Israeli airstrikes across the Gaza Strip reportedly killed at least 34 Palestinian people overnight and on Tuesday. Benjamin Netanyahu has also said that the Golan Heights, occupied by Israel for almost 60 years, will remain part of Israel, quote, for eternity, amid growing criticisms of an Israeli takeover of a previously demilitarized buffer zone in Syrian-controlled territory. The United Nations Security Council appears united on the need to preserve Syria's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and unity, the US and Russia said after a closed emergency meeting. The 15-member council will work on a joint statement on Syria in the coming days, they said. The UN Special Envoy to Syria, Geir Pedersen, cautioned Israel that its airstrikes and ground invasion into Syrian territory need to stop, and said its actions are in violation of the 1974 agreement between Israel and Syria. Diplomats from Qatar spoke with the rebel group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, and the regional states raced to open contact with the group that toppled Assad and positioned themselves favorably. The UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights War Monitor said today that Israel had, quote, destroyed the most important military sites in Syria, with about 250 airstrikes since the fall of President Bashar al-Assad's regime. The strikes had targeted airports and warehouses, aircraft squadrons, radars, military signal stations, and multiple weapons and ammunition depots over the past 48 hours. The Syrian Defense, also known as the White Helmets, has ended its search for possible remaining detainees at infamous prisons, adding it had not uncovered any, quote, any evidence of undiscovered secret cells or basements. Some European countries, including Germany, the UK, and Austria, have put asylum applications from Syrians on hold until further notice. The recovery of the American journalist Austin Tice held hostage in Syria was a, quote, top priority of the Biden administration. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told ABC's Good Morning America. Israel is now more optimistic about a possible hostage deal in Gaza, its Foreign Minister Gideon Saar said, amid reports that Hamas had asked for a list of all hostages supplied by militant groups in the Palestinian territories. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said President Vladimir Putin personally approved the decision to grant Bashar al-Assad asylum in Russia. Peskov said it was, quote, premature to discuss the future of Russia's military presence inside Syria. Benjamin Netanyahu has begun giving evidence in a court in Tel Aviv in his long-running corruption trial, becoming the first sitting Israeli Prime Minister to take the stand as a criminal defendant. So, William, I just want to focus on Syria. With Israel's recent incursions into Syrian territory, what do you think the future is going to look like for a Syrian state? Do you think it could risk going the way of like Iraq post Saddam Hussein, fractured?
That's perfectly possible. All things are possible at the moment. It's very difficult to call how it's going to go. There are maybe some good signs, but also some worrying signs. The Israeli incursion into Syria, which is what it is, even if it's undertaken for claimed defensive motivations, is a matter of some concern. And one can't help but observe that if Israel wanted to go considerably into Syria beyond where they currently are and beyond even the buffer zone, there wouldn't be very much to stop them right now because the state of the Syrian army is not in great shape. But it's really very difficult to tell where we go from here. Obviously, there was a lot of jubilation at the fall of Assad, and particularly from expats who have been in exile and then thinking in terms perhaps of going back. But I think, when a bad regime falls, it's maybe the worst regime until the next one. You never can be quite sure. And you always get warm words at the start. So there's a whole mess of things going on. And I think there will be reprisals against some of Assad's folk in the next few days, which may not be very pleasant. And we might begin to see the character of the new government. And we might also begin to see just how far Israel is going to go and how that's going to work into the general security of the region. But I think it would be premature to be just too hopeful right now.
So, moving on to our first story of the night, literacy and numeracy standards in Scotland reach record highs. The proportion of pupils achieving the expected level in literacy and numeracy across primary and secondary schools has reached a new high, official figures published today show. For numeracy, a record 80.3% of pupils across P1, P4 and P7 reached expected levels, while S3 also reached a new high of 90.3%. For literacy achievement is also at a record high in both primary 74% and secondary 88.3%. The attainment gap between young people from the most and least deprived areas meeting standards in literacy has also reached a near low, according to the latest achievement of Curriculum for Excellence levels 2023-24 statistics. Education Secretary Jenny Gilruth said, quote, "These figures demonstrate a clear rise in standards across Scotland's primary and secondary schools under this government. I am grateful to all of our teachers and schools who have worked incredibly hard to support children across the country to achieve record high levels of literacy and numeracy." The Scottish Government has been consistently clear in its aim to close the poverty-related attainment gap, which is why we are investing £1 billion in the Scottish Attainment Challenge and supporting the expansion of free school meals and breakfast clubs. These figures show that the extra support for disadvantaged pupils is having an impact, with the attainment gap in literacy rate at a record low. We absolutely recognise that there is still work to do and work to be done, but we should recognise that the significant progress these figures represent. So, William, what do you think behind this? These record figures?
Well, to put the record figures into context, we've only been, I think, collecting this information since 2016. And of course, a lot has happened since 2016, not least the COVID pandemic. But nevertheless, of those figures that have been collected, these are the best in terms of the numeracy and literacy of the three classes that are, I think it's actually 4 classes: primary 1, primary 4, primary 7 and S3. Those are, if you like, the signpost figures that you take to make this assessment. That is at a high, which is good, but there's still a long way to go. And it'll be quite noticeable, depending on the media outlet, how these percentages are treated, whether we look at 80% as being up to the level expected, or 20% are still not up to the level expected. And I think you might be getting a different story from different media outlets on that over the next 24 hours. But it's certainly it's a positive step, but it does need further investment, and I would suggest it probably needs more investment than the Scottish Government, with its current budgetary constraints, can put into it. But nevertheless, that's a good thing. On the attainment gap, it's always a wee bit difficult just concentrating on education to close the attainment gap, because the big thing you want to change is poverty. If you were able to make big inroads into poverty, then I think the attainment gap would much more readily close. Otherwise, it's a slow process. Having said that, what the Scottish Government is doing to close the attainment gap, which is to pour money into the things that equalise things a little bit, such as free school meals and breakfast clubs, and also by other measures such as the Scottish Child Payment, which helps to lift children out of poverty a wee bit more. Those are, I think, possibly having an effect. But as Jenny Gilruth admits, and as no doubt the critics of the government would say, there's far more that still needs to be done to really make that gap close. I would submit that it would require a change in the financial constraints for any Scottish government to really bring that about.
Just before we move on, I want to move to another part of the research. I guess the more negative part for the Scottish Government. There's also the figures that showed that pupils who were persistently absent, so I think absent for more than 10% of the school year, was also quite a bit. I think it's like 10-20% higher than it was 10 years ago. So just, in light of balance, I was wondering what you made of that.
Well, it's not good, but what you really need to get to the root of is why that would be.
Yeah.
And I would submit that for many kids, the world is a much more difficult place than it maybe was for kids 10 years ago. And maybe some of that needs to be looked at. I think you need a holistic set of solutions, and certainly to understand the nature of the problem before you can grapple with it. And I would also submit that this is probably an issue in the UK generally, and maybe further afield. So I've not really answered your question, but I think we need more information before we can answer it, is really the answer.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very hard question to answer, but I definitely agree with your sentiment. I think it is a holistic issue for sure. I agree with that. Looking at the time, a little bit behind, so I'll move on to our next story in British news. Chancellor Rachel Reeves announces spending review in Whitehall efficiency drive. Rachel Reeves has ordered Whitehall departments to submit their spending plans to, quote, challenge panels of private sector experts, including bankers, as part of her forthcoming spending review. Formally kicking off the next phase of the spending review process, the Chancellor said she was determined to wield an, quote, iron fist against waste by examining departments' expenditure line by line. As part of the review, Reeves will insist that every government department find efficiency savings of 5% of their budget for the coming year over the following 3 years, and established an independent committee to examine its proposals and make recommendations. The Scottish Government set out plans for a unique Scottish winter fuel payment and an end to the two-child benefit cap in its budget, and called the SNP. And the SNP has today called on Rachel Reeves to, quote, change course and use her spending review to reverse winter fuel payment cuts, national insurance rises, and the two-child benefit cap. The Labour government has had a nightmare start, with one of Sir Keir Starmer's first acts as Prime Minister being to suspend 7 of his own MPs after they backed an SNP motion to scrap the two-child benefit cap. Rachel Reeves' increase to national insurance employer contributions is estimated to average £800 per employee, which has been predicted to result in cutbacks in recruitment, lower wages, and possible redundancies. Commenting, SNP economy spokesperson Dave Dugan, MP, said, quote, Rachel Reeves will attempt to draw a line under the Labour government's disastrous start, but the fact is, unless they change course to reinstate the winter fuel payment, scrap the two-child cap, and roll back on the jobs tax, it's just more from a Labour Party that promised change and delivered misery. Quote, meanwhile, John Sweeney has shown decisive leadership by cleaning up Labour's mess and introducing a unique Scottish winter fuel payment and scrapping the two-child cap. Any Scottish politician worth their salt should put Scotland's interests first at every turn, and that's the type of government Scots can accept from the SNP. So, William, just sticking with waste, I feel like it's fair to say that there is quite a lot of waste in government spending, especially when you look at, stuff like the Edinburgh Tram is just an example of something very close to home, or many infrastructure programs. But I guess my question to you is like, do you think Labour are going to actually be successful in their attempt to address this waste and reduce spending by 5%? Or do you think it might just result in, like cuts to services?
It's the thin end of the wedge, I should imagine. We've had this sort of thing before from various governments about cutting and line by line going through your expenditure to try and be more efficient. The public sector, and this is part of the UK culture, and we draw our civil service here from the UK too. So the culture is one, I admit, of waste, and perhaps there is something to be said for looking at how you're spending money. I am not convinced that the mystique of the private sector and having bankers and think tanks and industrialists look at the spending and think this is the best way to go is necessarily going to result in better services. And there is a case, I think, maybe for talking to the people working in the public sector and the civil servants themselves about what they feel is inefficient and what can be improved without putting it past the private folks. Also, here's a real shaker. What about talking to the customers of the public services? What would they find to be an improvement? Because it's quite possible that the think tanks might come up with improvements that aren't really improvements from a customer perspective at all. So it's a complicated thing. I wish Rachel Reeves well in having undertaken it, no doubt, but I'm not sure she's going the right way about it.
I feel like it's interesting what you say about the private sector, because I feel like a lot of waste that can be identified with these wasteful government spending projects is actually like private companies making a lot of money off government expenditure, like in short lists.
Yes, that's true. But I mean, if you say private sector good, public sector bad, I've got two words for you: Thames Water.
No, totally. I'm still a bit behind, so I'm going to move to our next story, another British story. Cornwall Insights predict energy price cap rise in April as British Gas pay £300 million to shareholders. Centrithia, the owner of British Gas, has angered fuel poverty campaigners by offering its shareholders an extra £300 million this year, as millions of customers brace for rising energy bills through the winter. Centrithia expects to buy back shares worth £300 million before September, meaning it will have repurchased £1.5 billion in shares since November last year, equivalent to a fifth of the company's total market value. The company set out the shareholder windfall in a trading update weeks after the industry regulator announced that the average annual energy bill in England, Scotland and Wales would increase by £21 a year to £1,738 from January. Bills are expected to rise again in April to £1,762 a year for a typical dual-fuel consumer as a result of turbulence in the global energy markets, according to the forecasts from Cornwall Insights, a respected energy consultancy. This would put the average energy bill about £740 a year higher than before the energy crisis. Cornwall warned that the government's energy price cap could rise by an extra £20 a year on top of the £1,762 forecast for April 2025 if the government moved ahead with policy proposals that would raise the costs for households. These include extra costs to compensate heavy industry for its network costs, and a higher allowance for energy suppliers to recover payments which are not paid by those in energy debt. Dave Duguid, MP, the SNP's energy spokesperson, has called on Keir Starmer to announce a package of measures to help households with energy bills now and set a timetable for when Labour will deliver on its election pledge to cut energy bills by £300 a year. In October, Labour MPs blocked a Scottish National Party amendment to the GB Energy Bill to force the UK government to reduce energy bills by £300. Commenting, Mr Duguid said, quote, "Through Keir Starmer and the Labour Party promised voters he would reduce energy bills by £300, but instead bills have gone up again on the Labour Party's watch. A typical household will now be paying £194 more a year come April." Sub-zero temperatures have already descended on Scotland as griters take to the streets, while some Scottish households face the grim choice between eating or paying the highest energy bills in the land. Westminster is damaging Scotland, and the Labour MPs from here keep voting for it. So, William, I guess I've got more of a specific question on energy. How do you think the Labour government should be addressing it? Do you think energy should be nationalised and just taken out of private hands like they do in other countries, or do you think there's another more incremental solution?
I think the price of energy should not be linked to the price of oil/gas as it currently is. It should be linked to the price, the amount it costs to produce it. And if you were to do that, if you were to put renewables into the mix and cost it according to what it costs you to produce from renewables, I think that would result in lower energy bills. There's no reason whatsoever why energy bills in the UK should be significantly higher than they are elsewhere in Europe, but they are. And one of the reasons for that is not just the state of the market, although that, as I've just said, does need to be fixed, but also I think there's a clear case of profiteering here from the likes of Centrica, which has raked in £7 billion in profits since the start of the energy crisis. And I think I would certainly be looking at greater taxation of those amounts so that that money could be put into at least compensating people for the higher bills in some way, even if you can't immediately reduce the bills. So I think the Labour Party the Labour government can be doing a lot more to alleviate what people are going through. And of course, particularly, it's going to be bad in Scotland as we get through the winter, simply because we tend to be colder than up there. And possibly not particularly well insulated either. So I think the market needs reform, and I think the companies need to stop profiteering or be made to stop profiteering by the tax regime. And a combination of those two would certainly get us somewhere. Tinkering around the edges, as they're currently doing, is resulting in the rate is maybe going up by £20 and a quarter, but it's just the same level, on and on and on. And it's unaffordable for most people.
So now moving on to our next story in Scottish news, amendments to Scottish Elections Bill. The Scottish Government has said it will support amendments to the Elections Bill which have been lodged by Conservative MSP Graham Simpson with support from Scottish Green MSP Ross Greer. The amendments will ban MSPs from holding dual mandates as MPs or peers. The amendments will require ministers to lay regulations to prohibit MSPs or members of Scottish Parliament from also becoming members of the British Parliament, and to prohibit MSPs from also being a member of the House of Lords. Commenting, Minister for Parliamentary Business Jamie Hepburn said, quote, "This government has been clear that it is supportive of ending the practice of dual mandates, where MSPs are also able to become MPs or peers. Parliament had not fully considered the issue during stage 1 of the Scottish Election Bill, so I committed to holding a public consultation on the issue to allow political parties, COSLA, and most importantly, the public to comment. Quote, I have worked closely with Graham Simpson, MSP, ahead of the final stage of the bill to ensure that amendments to the bill, if passed by Parliament, will mean that regulations informed by the consultation response can be introduced in 2025 to prohibit MSPs from also serving as MPs and peers ahead of the 2026 general election. Or sorry, not general election, Scottish election. Quote, I will publish the public consultation in January 2025 and introduce regulations in autumn 2025, which will then be subject to scrutiny and a vote by MSPs. Quote, I hope the Parliament will support these amendments as a good solution to ensure the issue of dual mandate can be considered properly and regulations informed fully, whilst ensuring the changes can take place ahead of the 2026 election. So, William, just what do you make of this development, and do you think it's a good thing?
I think it's a good thing. It's been coming for a little while, ever since Stephen Flynn and Stephen Gethins and Dave Duguid announced that they were thinking in terms of standing for the 2026 Scottish election, despite already being MPs in Westminster. Um, Stephen Flynn has reversed out of that. I'm not sure about the other two at this stage. And of course, there is a history of it happening. Alex Salmond did it for a time. Douglas Ross, most recently, has been doing it. But I think it's a good thing because I don't think, if we're taking Scotland seriously, serving as an MSP should be seen as a part-time job. I think it's totally a full-time job, and a representative's full energies should be devoted to doing it. So I'm actually pleased to see it coming in legislation if it's agreed, and being done in a practical way. I think there need to be exceptions that allow an MP to stand to be an MSP and vice versa, as long as they resign, if successful, the role that they've been in previously. You don't want somebody, as I think Joanna Cherry was faced with recently, to have to make the decision in advance and take chances. So as long as it's done in that way, I think it's a perfectly sensible thing to do, and I imagine the consultation will bear that out.
Yeah, it seems quite strange that one of the most important jobs in the country can be a part-time job or just done alongside being an MP. So yeah, I agree with you there. It's a very weird
Yeah.
situation. Moving on to our next story, which is on research that's just been released by St. Andrews University. Ethnic groups 2.5 more times more likely to have experienced death of someone close during the COVID crisis. Ethnic groups in Scotland were over 2 times more likely to experience the death of someone close to them during COVID-19 than the white population, according to a groundbreaking report released today by researchers from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. The report, entitled Racism, Belonging and COVID's Legacy of Ethnic Inequality in Scotland, was authored by Professor Nitha Finlay from the School of Geography and Sustainable Development. It found that in Scotland, experiencing bereavement was highest for those identifying with any other ethnic group, 68%, Indian, 44%, and Pakistani, 38%. The national average was around 25%. Similar levels of bereavement experienced were found for ethnic minority groups in England and Wales, and the report is a collaboration between researchers at the Centre of Dynamics of Ethnicity, CODE, at the University of St. Andrews and the University of Manchester, and the Ethnic Minority Voluntary Sector umbrella body, BEMIS, and has for the first time collected data to show the ethnic inequalities in experience of bereavement during the COVID-19 pandemic. The report also collated data around various questions relating to discrimination and racism in Scotland's ethnic groups, including attitudes to nationhood, belonging, political trust, and relationship to policing. It revealed that 9 in 10 Black Caribbean respondents in Scotland had recent experiences of racist insults. Other minorities, Chinese 44%, other Black 41%, and White Irish 33%, had also experienced an insult in the last 5 years for reasons to do with their ethnicity, race, or religion. Nissa Finlay, the professor of human geography at St Andrews, director of the Evidence for Equality National Survey, founding member of the Centre of Dynamics and Ethnicity, and member of the ESRC Centre for Population Change. She has researched, taught, and published widely on ethnic inequalities, residential mobility, housing, neighborhood change, segregation, and research methods. So, William, what do you think's behind these disparities?
The disparities in COVID bereavements,
Yeah.
I think very possibly racism at some level is involved in how patients are treated by the health service. There may be other complicating factors as well. For example, people of different ethnicities might have different family structures or social networks, so perhaps they're more likely to be connected to somebody who dies.
Yeah.
Maybe different underlying health, as was sometimes postulated during the COVID pandemic, maybe different levels of poverty or deprivation. And this is perhaps where the racism kicks in a little bit, differential access to care and support services. So I think it was fairly well known that different ethnicities have different death rates. So we're looking now
Yeah.
at bereavement rates and seeing how that works through. But we still haven't really got to the absolute bottom of what needs to change in order for these figures not to happen the next time. And yes, racism is undoubtedly, I would say, involved. And the other questions that have been asked of various ethnic groups show that we've got a lot we need to improve in Scotland, just as in other parts of the UK, with regard to that. We needn't be exceptional about Scottish exceptionalism. We're better than other folk at this. Isn't necessarily the case, and we shouldn't become complacent. There's a lot of work still to be done.
That's an interesting point, yeah. And now moving on to our next story. In American news, 77 Nobel laureates urge the US Senate to reject Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s nomination. 77 Nobel laureates have signed a letter urging the US Senate to reject Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Donald Trump's nominee for Health and Human Services Secretary, arguing that he is unfit and would put American public health, quote, in jeopardy. This is thought to be the first time in living memory that Nobel Prize winners have united against a presidential cabinet pick, and comes against a backdrop of Kennedy's public support for discredited theories, including a claim that childhood vaccines cause autism. In their letter, prize winners in the fields of medicine, chemistry, physics, and economics castigate Kennedy for a, quote, lack of credentials, and point out that he has been a, quote, belligerent critic of some of the agencies that he would oversee, including the FDA, NIH, and Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC. Quote, the proposal to place Mr. Kennedy in charge of the federal agencies responsible for protecting the public health of American citizens and for conducting the medical research that benefits our country and the rest of humanity has been widely criticized on multiple grounds, the laureates say in the letter first published by the New York Times. They also point to Kennedy's vocal opposition to the measles and polio vaccines, his support for ending fluorine being put in the water supply, and his promotion of conspiracy theories over the treatments of AIDS and other diseases. In their letter, the Nobel laureates wrote, quote, the leader of DHHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, that is, should continue to nurture and improve, not threaten, these highly respected institutions and their employees. Signatories include Victor Ambroth and Gary Ruvkun, who won this year's Nobel Prize for Psychosociology or Medicine for the discovery of microRNA. The letter comes after Trump, who has previously spoken of letting Kennedy go wild with health, suggested in an interview with NBC that his Health and Human Services nominee could investigate the supposed link between vaccines and autism, a theory that has been debunked. So, William, just more broadly, I guess, on RFK's nomination, what do you think the impact of him being basically in control of American health will be? And I guess maybe 2 points in that question. So, firstly, do you think some of his more out there views about vaccines are actually going to make their way into American health policy? Do you think it'll be held back? And secondly, maybe more controversially, do you think there might actually be any politics of him becoming, taking on this role? Because he has made statements, as well as the more conspiratorial statements, he has made a lot of statements about wanting to regulate the fast food industry, for example, and banning private health companies from advertising their drugs, on TV. So, like, what do you think broadly his nomination, if it becomes?
Yeah. Kennedy has said a lot of things. Not all of them are necessarily bad. You touched on a few of the better ones later, but there are some other bits that are, by common consent amongst the vast majority of the scientific community, way out there. And the attitude to vaccines and the conspiracy theories and the taking fluoride out of the water supply are certainly amongst those. So it's I think he has the capacity to fix a few things, but also to cause a considerable amount of damage. And I wouldn't necessarily put my money on the average American being any healthier afterwards as a result. Of course, one could always be wrong, but hey, can 77 Nobel laureates be wrong? It's very unusual for them to take a step like this, as you said. Although one would also observe that a number of Nobel laureates not unadjacent to 77, possibly even slightly more than that, made a point of endorsing Kamala Harris in October. So they've got some a record, shall we say, in perhaps getting involved in politics rather more than Nobel laureates used to do. Whether it will have any effect on the public, I don't know. The American public, when consulted, I understand, 47% of those consulted thought Kennedy was a good pick for health secretary against 34% that
Yeah, I
thought
saw
he
that.
wouldn't. And I think there were five potential picks who were cited in this survey, and he got the best percentage at 47%. So Kennedy does have some public support. I mean, we live in very weird times, but perhaps the Nobel laureates are hoping that it will sway some senators on the Republican side, perhaps to consider voting against Kennedy. And that's not an entirely forlorn hope because I think the figures are that he only needs about 3 Republican votes, assuming all the Democrats vote against him. He only needs 3 votes to go against him on the Republican side in order not to be picked. So they've put their hat in the ring. Let's see what the effect is. Maybe it will influence people. Maybe it will influence them the other way. You never know.
I guess just before I move on, like, how likely do you think it is that Kennedy's going to end up getting the place? Because he's a free Republican. Like, he was a Democrat until very recently, and a lot of Republicans do have issues with him on various issues. Even Donald Trump, I think, brought up differences he
Yeah.
has between what was it, on climate change or
It's
environmental regulations.
I wouldn't wish to gamble on it, but I think there's a fair chance because only a few Republicans need to go against him that he won't be picked. And the same may be true of a number of the
Yeah.
out there candidates who have not so far withdrawn. But America is a very, very unpredictable place right now. So um, get the popcorn out and just hope that we don't get any of the blowback over here, I think is the answer.
So now we'll move on to a Brazilian news story. Brazilian President Lula da Silva, in intensive care after emergency brain surgery. The president of Brazil is recovering in intensive care after having undergone emergency surgery after a brain bleed was detected during a MRI scan. At about 2:28 a.m. local time, the medical team at Cirori Libanese Hospital in Sao Paulo held a press conference to announce the surgery to drain a hematoma caused by bleeding in the president's brain had been successful. Quote, the president had progressed well. He returned from surgery almost fully awake and has been exuberated, said Lula's personal doctor, the cardiologist Dr. Robert Khalil. He added that Lula is, quote, now stable, speaking normally, eating, and will remain under observation in the coming days. According to doctors, the 79-year-old Lula da Silva underwent a sorry, my pronunciation is terrible. Basically, having a 3 centimeter hole made in the skull to insert a drain to remove the bleeding. The doctors attributed the hemorrhage to a fall that Lula had in October while taking a shower in the Alvara Palace, the official presidential residence in Brasilia. The accident forced Lula to cancel a trip to a BRIC summit being held in Russia and left him with several stitches. Lula was admitted to hospital in Brasilia on Monday night after complaining of a headache. When the hemorrhage was detected, he was transferred 620 miles south to one of Brazil's top hospitals for the operation. The newspaper O Globo said Lula arrived in Sao Paulo at about 11 p.m. on Monday, and by 4:45 a.m. he had undergone the surgery. Quote, throughout the journey, both by ambulance and by air, the president was lucid, alert, and speaking, just as he is now, lucid, alert, speaking, and eating, said Dr. Ana Helena Germologio, who was the first to attend Lula after his fall in October, and again on Monday. Lula was accompanied on the journey and in the hospital by the First Lady, Rosangela da Silva, known as Jana. Khalil repeatedly emphasized during the press conference that the president, quote, suffered no brain injury and had no neurological impairment. He said the hematoma was, quote, completely drained. The president will remain under observation in the intensive care unit for at least 48 hours and is only expected to return to Brasilia at the beginning of next week, the doctor said. A medical bulletin is expected to be released early on Wednesday morning. So, William, do you think this is going to have any impact in Brazilian politics? Because I can definitely see some on the right of Brazil potentially using this, like with Biden in America, as an attack line against Lula.
Well, Lula is 79 years of age, and I think has 2 years to go. So the parallels with Biden might not be entirely fallacious. Anybody can fall in the shower, and anybody can have a brain bleed at even much lesser age. But it is a hard thing to recover from in a short time when you're 79 years of age. He does have a history of health issues, going back to 1964, where he lost a finger in an accident when he was working as a mechanic in a car parts factory. He's had high blood pressure problems in 2010 when he was 64 years of age, laryngeal cancer in 2011 when he was 66 years of age, which he had a full recovery, but he had a lingering hoarseness, which was spoken of in the 2022 election. So, and of course, a hip replacement. I forgot his hip replacement. That's not an unusual thing in somebody that age. In fact, he's done well to keep his hips going that long. So, I suppose one can say that suggests he's actually fairly robust. But yeah, I think maybe how he recovers and how tired he is and how much energy he's able to throw into his job will be brought up by the opposition, who will, I suspect, be only too happy to see him replaced as quickly as possible. I very much doubt he'll be going, by the way, for a further term when he hits the age of 81. So there's going to be some uncertainty in Brazilian politics by that time anyway.
Yeah, because am I wrong in thinking that Bolsonaro also can't run in the next election? He was disqualified, was he not?
That would possibly be for legal reasons. Not quite sure about that one, but don't worry. If there isn't a Bolsonaro, there'll be a something else or all.
Yeah. We were interesting in the next election if neither of those two are running. Like, I have no idea what's going to happen in that. But anyway, looking at the time, I'll move on to our second last story, which is on Scotland. The Scottish Government and COSLA agree on improving educational outcomes for children and young people. Following an agreement between the Scottish Government and COSLA on education funding and provision, the following joint statement has been issued by Education Secretary Jenny Gilruth and COSLA spokesperson. For children and young people, Tony Buchanan. Quote, Scotland's national and local government have reaffirmed their agreement to delivering improved outcomes for children and young people. Quote, local government and the Scottish government are committed to working together to restore teaching levels to 2023 levels next year and freeze learning hours which will support the learning experience for pupils across Scotland. Both local government and the Scottish government have also agreed to make meaningful progress towards reducing class contact time for teachers in recognition of the asks made by teachers and teaching unions. Medium and long-term joint workforce planning will take into account the importance of responding to issues, including different local needs. In order to support each of these measures, the Scottish Government is increasing the funding available to local government to £186.5 million and will issue over £145 million to local government in full this financial year. Quote, local government will also receive additional funding of £28 million from 2025 to 2026 to develop the additional support for learning ASL education workforce, along with an enhanced offer in support spanning all stages of the curriculum from the early years to the end of secondary. Further funding of £1 million is also being made available to support national initiatives which will help to recruit and train more ASL teachers. Quote, to drive improvement, the education across Scotland and at a local level, a joint board educational assurance board will be established to achieve our shared objectives to improve attainment, attendance, and improve relationships and behaviour. This activity will build on existing initiatives already in place in Scotland, which see local government and the Scottish Government working together to close the poverty-related attainment gap, such as the Pupil Equity Fund, which is allocated to head teachers, and strategic equity funding. Quote, all these measures will contribute to and acknowledge the critical importance of delivering excellence and equity in education for all children in Scotland. So, William, what do you make of that story and the most recent development?
Well, it's been a decent day for Jenny Gilruth, the Education Secretary, on the whole. I think this was probably in the same speech as when she was talking about the numeracy and literacy. And it's the other area of putting funds into trying to shrink the attainment gap and getting a decent pupil teacher ratio. And it is currently the lowest in the UK, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
At 13 to 3. And seeing if you can improve that by bringing teacher levels back, even as the number of pupils is shrinking, is also a good thing. It's small sums of money in the scheme of things, but nevertheless, if it makes a difference, that's all part of the integrated boost to education that we really need. In international terms, according to PISA, we're sliding a little bit. I'm not entirely sure that PISA is necessarily the most valid measure, and many educationalists aren't, but that would be something to look at if we could improve that as well. I think that would be well worth doing. But overall, yeah, a good day for Jenny Gilruth, and I hope she can put her feet up with a nice glass of wine tonight.
So finally, with our last story of the night, the Scottish Government support for entrepreneurs to start and grow businesses. The Scottish Government has said that there will be a package of measures to help entrepreneurs start and grow their businesses delivered next year as a result of funding in the draft Scottish budget for 2025 to 26. As part of a £15 million investment, at least £4 million will be invested to women entrepreneurs by providing tailored support at the earliest stage of business creation. The initiative contributes to overall spending of £34.7 million across entrepreneurship, innovation and social enterprise, a 50% increase on 2024 to 2025. This includes a continued investment in TechScaler, the Scottish Government's flagship programme for tech startups. There will also be a new round of ecosystem ecosystem fund and a new fund to further develop clusters in sectors such as life sciences, digital advanced manufacturing. Deputy First Minister Kate Forbes visited Gutwealth, an Edinburgh-based startup, to discuss founder Gemma Stewart's experience of starting a business. Gutwealth was a recent winner at the Scottish Government Support Scottish Edge Awards. The Deputy First Minister said, quote, "This budget commitment demonstrates that the Scottish Government stands squarely behind this and future generations of business talent. I want everyone from every walk of life to feel encouraged and supported in taking the first steps on their entrepreneurial journey. Quote, a growing, thriving startup ecosystem is vital to a strong and growing economy, and I want to make Scotland the best place in the world for founders to launch and grow a startup business." Quote, taking a close steer from Anna Stewart and Mark Logan's report into encouraging more women to start their own businesses, the Scottish Government and our partners are building an end-to-end support network to ensure entrepreneurs are helped at each stage of their journey. Gemma's success story is one that we must rely on and replicate. So, William, what do you think the impact of this is going to be when we start our businesses? Just firstly.
Well, I think it's going to have a good impact in a fairly small way, to be fair. But supporting entrepreneurs is important because entrepreneurs tend to know what they're doing when they start businesses because it's what they specialize in that they're working with. And Gemma Stewart is an example of that. And in the early stages of a business, it does need support. So if there are schemes in place and they're properly funded, then that helps. But business success, particularly in the early stages when it's easiest to fail, depend on a lot of things, some of which are out with the Scottish Government's control. The national insurance changes that may make it less advantageous to employ people, for example, energy costs and business rates, and having a customer base with money in their pockets. All of those are just ever so slightly out of the control of the Scottish Government. So I get another sense of it doing what it can with a constrained budget in a world that's not entirely under their control, and I applaud them for that. But we can do much better, and we could do much better if we had control of all our financial levers and were able properly to create a business environment where businesses could thrive and customers had enough money to avail themselves of their services.
That's a good answer, so I think we'll end with that. But before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We set our current fundraising target in April, hoping to reach £36,000 by the end of the year. It's now December and we've only raised just about £18,500, just over half of our target. However, to pay our bills and survive, we urgently need to raise at least £12,000. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around £2,500. We need more regular subscribers, but we need to clear out our debts as well. We are really at crisis point and really need to increase our donations to be able to pay our bills and survive. Our programs will always be free to view, however, if you can just afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter and please donate whatever you can afford. So thank you to our guest, William. Thanks, William.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it. Hope everybody else did too.
Hope so too. Goodbye and thank you for watching.